Welcome to Soul Led Creative Women, a podcast for women passionate about personal growth, seeking bold, brave tools to navigate life's ups and downs. So today I have Maggie Parr with me. Maggie is an artist and author who has designed theme park attractions, painted murals and portraits, and written and illustrated books and comics for over 3 decades. Art making has also helped her recover from many forms of self-harming, and she now teaches others how to use creativity to break through blocks and achieve self-actualization. So welcome, Maggie.
Thank you so much, Samantha. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So, as I kind of hinted at there, today we're going to be talking about self healing, but specifically art as a powerful tool for self healing. So, first, let's start with your journey, Maggie. Tell us about your own healing journey and how art and creativity have become part of your story.
Yes, art has always been integral to my healing, even before I realized it was. Just escaping by drawing dragons and castles and things growing up to literally painting what I felt inside, but also painting the self-harming. Like I used to cut myself, and so I would cut into the gesso and drip red paint. So it was literally a new way to channel energies that I didn't understand, that didn't make sense inside. And writing and illustrating and everything I can to express what's inside me. It's just been a natural part of what I do, and now I try to help others do the same thing.
Mm. So your journey, obviously, self-harm is, one of the big topics that you've experienced yourself, but also that you kind of support others with. So tell us a bit about the self-harm piece. Why do you believe people self-harm? And, is this a byproduct of deeper trauma?
I think it's always a byproduct of deeper trauma. It used to be Some people used to assume that it was always associated with childhood sexual abuse, and that's not always the case.
Hmm.
It was in my case, but I've known other people who didn't have that experience. So there are different factors, but it is a natural human thing that happens. It happens among other primates, it happens among other animals who are in lab settings. It addresses a feeling of not being able to express yourself in any other way except through this particular release. And I thought I was the only one at the time. I started I started at 4, but I switched to razors at 12, which was 1979, and nobody knew anything about it at that point, at least in the US. And so I was growing and learning as the field of psychology was growing and learning. So well-meaning therapists tried to help me, but the majority of what I had to learn came from my own studies within. And so that's where creativity came into play. But as I was researching the book that I wrote, Creator's Guide to Stopping Self-Harm, I was amazed at how prevalent this behavior is, not just among teenage girls, which is what most people assume.
Mm.
It's statistically about 14% of the entire population in the United States alone, and very similar in England and Australia, have self-harmed at some point in their lives. 5% of adults self-harm, 2 or 3% of kids below teenager self-harm. So
Mm.
it's actually almost equal between men and women, males and
Mm.
females, and through all cultures. So it's not just, US.
And by self-harm, are you talking about cutting, or are there different? I'm being potentially very naive when it comes to this topic.
Yeah,
So tell me
yeah.
about
And
what that looks like for different people.
yes, in the US, the DSM, which is the Diagnostical Statistical Manual, they list the behavior of cutting and burning oneself as NSSI, which means non-suicidal self-injury. And it's different from people who have, say, trichotillomania, who pull their hair out, things like that. There are
Hmm.
specific forms of self-harm that have other diagnoses, but there's no real diagnosis with cutting. It's considered a area of further study. So even among psychologists, they've had to figure things out as they go along from anecdotal and clinical experience, but there is no actual clinical psychological understanding of why people do this. It's just something people do. Some people
Mm.
it's an expression of what they call borderline personality disorder, which has
Hmm.
some controversy. It's a little politically controversial because it's usually applied to women. But I didn't have that diagnosis. I was one of the majority of cutters, people who burned and cut themselves, who haven't had borderline personality disorder. So for me, it was this secret thing that I started doing more intensely at 12 in order to deal with unbearable feelings. And
Mm,
oddly enough, it was soothing. It was an escape, and it made me feel powerful, and it made me feel nurturing towards myself because I would care for my wound afterwards. And it
mm.
also became highly addictive to the point where I struggled with it off and on until my mid 40s, when I
Okay.
finally found a really good therapist. And therapy, the field of therapy had grown enough that I was able to be a recipient of trauma therapy modalities, which were not available when I was younger. And so I
Sure.
was able to get to the root of it and really consciously utilize my creativity to go inward and
Mm,
find the root of why I was doing this.
mm. And so I'm sure we'll talk about this later on, but the word intention there, in terms of you intentionally chose to use your creativity to support you
Yes.
with that. That's amazing.
Yes.
So when people think of, we've touched on this, just you've already sort of mentioned it, but when people think of self-harm, I'm sure most of them would consider that it's a younger person's issue. Does it always start when people are younger? And how is this topic relevant to older women?
Yeah, it usually does start when we're younger, but it does persist. I was also bulimic. It's rare that someone just cuts or burns. There's often other coexisting conditions. I was bulimic. I was addicted to drugs and alcohol, so I had to get sober and stop the food things before I was really ready to deal with this. But when I relapsed, I had like maybe 12, 13 years without cutting in my 30s into my mid 40s. And then I was going through a painful divorce and a lot of personal crises. And I relapsed into cutting, and I ended up in a urgent care with second degree burns on my arm. And I was mortified, and I couldn't find anything online about older women. It was all geared towards younger women. I found one. This was back in 2012, so there weren't a whole lot of
Mhm.
there wasn't the kind of social media presence we have now. So I did find a sort of chat group for people who self-harm. And on there, I saw people posting who did not relate because they were older. There were some grandmothers, there were people who were married and had kids, and they were very ashamed of it. So I knew I wasn't alone. It's just that none of the literature addresses that.
Mm. And so, on your journey, when did people become aware of the self-harming around you? Was it something that you were always able to hide, or was it something that actually you could no longer hide at some points in time?
When I was young, that was part of the issue of the dysfunction of my home was that nobody noticed. It was like being
Mm,
invisible. Until someone in my swim team, I swam, and so obviously I had wounds on my arms and my forehead, and nobody said a word until a fellow swimmer went to a mental hospital for his self-harming, and then everyone noticed, and his mother pointed it out to my mother and said, "You have to look." And I don't fault her for that now. She had her own struggles, and we've come a
hmm
long way in
hmm
our relationship. But the not seeing it was a big symptom of why I needed to do it. No one was seeing
Right.
what pain I was in. And then later in my 40s, I was in a relationship with somebody who did not understand, and it upset her very much, and she was not very nice about it. So it was a different kind of thing. I had to hide it in order to feel safer. So
Mm,
it's only with the book that I really started talking about it fully out
mm,
loud as a way to finally get it out, but also to so that other people who read it they wouldn't feel as alone and know that they're not
mm.
the only ones.
So, you talked a bit about it being a form of expression, but actually really it's you trying to communicate with the people around you as well, right? And trying to get their attention almost, but in a hidden, subtle way, if they can
Yeah,
notice and I get caught out, then they're listening to me and they're seeing me.
exactly.
So, wow, that's
At the
really
same time, I hid the scars under my
yes.
sleeve a lot. But
Yes.
I've read a wonderful article called "The Voice on the Skin," and that's how I see the cutting. It's a voice on the skin. It's part of us that wants to be heard, but doesn't know how
Mm,
else to express what's inside.
mm. And so, as your creative journey has, expanded and grown, because ultimately it always will, Have you been able to replace then some of that expression and communication through your art? Has that been a really big
Absolutely.
part of it? Yeah. So,
Yes.
so why do you believe then creativity is so important for healing the deep trauma and dealing with things like this then?
Do we have another 3 hours? I could talk
I
about
know.
that forever. I
There's lots of
actually,
layers, right?
yes. Let me see what I can come up with the simplest version. Well, there's a physiological aspect, which is that if you've ever read the book Art, Your Brain on Art
Yeah.
by, yes, Ivy Ross and Susan Magsamen, they go into all the studies that are being done on neuroplasticity and how art making and interacting with art creates new avenues in our brains. So
Mm,
there's that aspect. So while I'm resisting the urge to cut and instead channeling it into artwork, new neural pathways are being laid
mhm,
in my brain. But the emotional spiritual part is, and the way I explain this in the book is that the act of cutting, I think, is a creative act. It's unique. It's a way of self-regulating and expressing ourselves without committing suicide, without harming
mhm,
anybody else, without falling apart. In a weird way, it held me together. So it's a creative thing. I sort of came up with that on my own, the way that I do it. And everybody does the cutting in their own way. We often use, and I've read this from other cutters, is that we use special blade. It's like very sacred almost. It's a ritual similar to setting up to paint or setting up to create in some
right.
way. And it's a very spiritual connection. There's a like channeling an energy when I was self-harming that's in a similar to when I channel the muse to paint. So
Mm.
there are many connections there.
Yeah, I mean, in my own work, the concept that the creative journey and spiritual expansion and growth, these two things are operating in duality, right? They mirror each other and they actually feed each other.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expand a bit on your own experience of that?
Yeah, there's a reason why people call it the muse and think of it as a sacred process of connecting with a goddess of some kind, because it feels like plugging into something bigger than ourselves.
Mm,
Now, I do commercial art, and that's different than my own personal art for healing. My personal art for healing, I'll put certain music on, similar to how I would listen to music when I would self-harm. I put certain music on and I let go and let this energy whoosh through me. And I usually cry for a moment and then it passes. And I'm plugged into creator, like creative
mm,
energy, the creator. And that's healing. It's innately healing.
mm,
And I've always followed, because I had the work for money, I was able to protect my work for myself from having to sell it. So I just go where it leads me. And that has been
mm,
part of the journey. One of my favorite phrases I uncovered from writing the book is that the wound holds the answer. And
mhm,
so for me, going into the wound, cutting into the gesso, painting red lines, for me, and then making something beautiful out of it, that was a way to channel spirit energy to heal me through the painting.
that's so beautiful. I love that. So good. So, I mean, we're talking a lot about, healing and overcoming challenges, and using creativity for that. But do you also see creativity as a tool for thriving, and empowerment?
Yes, absolutely. You don't have to be an artist to use creativity. It's our human birthright.
Hmm.
Anyone can draw. It's funny when I tell people I'm an artist, most people say, I can't even draw stick figures, which I think is, I wasn't asking if you could draw, but
Yeah.
secondly, yes, you can draw stick figures. Everybody
Yes.
can. When we can
Yes.
draw when we're kids and then we're taught, it's sort of like the fun is taken out of it for us because we can't imitate something. But we can all draw and paint with color. We can do a pottery class. All of it is fun and a way
Hmm.
to channel this creative, spiritual, fun, healing energy
Mm.
if we let ourselves.
Mm. So, what do you wish more people knew about the power of creativity and art?
I wish more people would give themselves permission
Yeah.
to create what they can. People seem to
Mm.
think if I can't paint a landscape and make it look like what I'm looking at, then I might as well not even try.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about your own creative practice and how that's changed over time. I like from what you're saying, I can see that you've kind of got different creative practices which you're using in different
Hmm.
ways. But tell us a bit about the journey, and how different it's looked over time for you.
Yes, that's a good question. And if I had my ducks in a row, I keep waiting to have all my ducks in a row so I can sum it all up in one sentence. But
Mm,
my creativity and my practice is pretty much whatever I need to do in the moment. Sometimes it's because I have a deadline for a commission
hmm
or a project. I used to do a lot more design projects. Sometimes I feel like I have to create today on my own paintings because it's bursting out of me. So it really
hmm
is a little bit more chaotic than I prefer. But I have learned to embrace rituals and discipline so that I
Yeah.
have morning rituals that keep me going. Discipline equals freedom, I've discovered. So I stick to certain things every day as best I can. And
Mm,
I've learned that I can do more writing in the morning and then I don't like to get into my studio until afternoon. So I let myself
okay.
off the hook for that. And I have slowly learned to listen to what my body and my soul need so that I arrange my day accordingly. And because I'm self-employed, I can do that.
Mm. And almost creating rituals around it, like you said,
Hmm.
when it feels like the right thing to do for you.
Hmm.
I mean, for me personally, sometimes if I get really excited about a new project or a new idea, I can kind of get some kind of tunnel vision with it
Yeah,
and kind of go overboard, and then that creates some kind of burnout. So I think the boundaries creatively are as important as, kind of letting the
right.
natural ebb and flow happen as well, having the rest
Mhm.
times. So,
I think it's harder for women too because we often we juggle so many different things when we
yeah.
multitask and commitments and I think a lot of times throughout history men have been able to do that linear tunnel vision. Let's just focus on this one thing because there are
Yeah.
women around them to take care
Yeah.
of all the other stuff.
Yeah, yeah, but it can take over. And I think,
Mhm.
you've got to be careful of that too. Just
Yeah.
because you have the urge to create doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't also have boundaries around, how
Mhm.
much time you spend, in
Good
that
point.
in that realm. Yeah, because it can
Mhm.
burn you out too. And then you feel really blocked spiritually, because you've
Right.
overdone it almost. You've,
Hmm.
you've gone too far.
Yeah.
So, for all the women out there who are curious about using their creative practice as a tool for healing deep trauma,
Mhm.
what powerful message or question would you like to leave them with today?
What is your wound trying to say? And we all have a wound. For me, it was literally listening to what was the voice on my skin was saying. And for me, that meant going in and meeting the being inside that I thought was, that I called the cutter, that I realized was my little kid, my tomboy kid. And I
Mm,
renamed and folded that part back into myself and did the work. So with other people, because I do teach people different things around painting, sometimes it's technique, sometimes it's finding your purpose and your voice. And it is always a journey of where is that painful part that you don't want to see and what are they trying to say? Because we all have that something that is a wound we carry with us that wants to be heard. And
mm,
speaking verbally articulating it is not always possible. And
mm.
so if that part of you were to say something that really needs you to hear, the artist, the woman to hear,
Yeah.
what are they trying to say? How can you get that out? Can you draw a little comic? Can you
Mm,
put some colors on a canvas? Can you write it out with your left hand? There's all kinds of ways to approach it sort of from the side, not straight on,
mm.
to listen to the part of us that we don't want to hear.
And when we go on that journey, there's going to be a heap of resistance there. I know in my own, art practice, sometimes the things that I'm called to paint are the things that I don't want to paint, or I'm resisting in some way. Tell us about your experience with resistance in allowing, the art to
Mhm.
flow freely.
I didn't experience a lot of resistance in the art flowing freely in that area. I've not had blockages. I
Okay,
don't know why. Maybe because I arranged my life so that I would always be able to do it if it called.
okay,
But I do know that feeling of I don't want to look, people to see this, or I don't want this is really intense. I've done some really intense paintings,
okay.
and sometimes what's an interesting exercise, this is one of my favorite exercises. I'll get a painting started and it's it seems like it's like done, but not quite. And I don't know how to break through that cutter part of me, who I've renamed Faith. I'll let Faith go in and put a coat of blue over the whole thing or some color or cover it in some way and then start pulling out that layer
Okay.
so things come out. So I'm allowing a little bit of a different image to come forth. And then that actually sometimes bypasses my conscious process and allows that faith voice to come through.
That's a really cool way of doing it. Is that with oil? Do you do that with oil? Is
Yeah,
that,
with
yeah,
oil, I've done it with
okay.
acrylic, but oil is good because it stays wet for a long time. But
Yeah, acrylic would be harder on some surfaces, I
right.
think. Yeah,
Or even if it's paint, if it's drawn on paper, you could cut it into pieces and make a collage out of it. Like try something completely different
yeah. Or you
and
could
see what
scratch
comes out.
through, potentially scratch through the
Scratch through.
paint. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
So how can people get to know you better, Maggie, and get a real feel for the work that you're doing?
There's always maggieparr.com. Parr is my last name.
Hmm.
If you are someone who struggles with self-harming or love someone who is, I would recommend going to stoppingselfharm.com. It's
Okay.
a website I put up, and I'm not a therapist. I always recommend people go to therapy and get the help they need, but I can help with creative exercises that help with healing.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming and chatting with me today, Maggie. I loved our
Thank you for having
conversation.
me. Yes, same
Thank
here.
you. Hey, Sam here. Thanks so much for listening to the end. If you'd like to keep the conversation going, I would absolutely love to hear from you. Join my free soul led creative community and gain access to free guides and resources, plus exclusive events and workshops, all from within the members area. This is your chance to connect with me and other like minded souls. Please head to samhorton.co/community. Take care.